you turned it up because they were feeling cold earlier. If the temperature doesn't go down, well, we'll see what we can do, but we should be all right. A couple of notices before I introduce our speaker for this evening. The programme doesn't make it clear tomorrow during the short paper session, but there will be a refreshment break in the middle of the short paper session. So there will be no short papers between 11 and 11:30, and there will be coffee and tea available in the foyer out here. That's tomorrow morning. And for those who wish to go to a service of Christian worship, you'll find that there are details of Roman Catholic services actually in the handbook. I was thinking of organising something quite independently, but I've thought better of it, and I will be taking a party to St Giles Church for their 8 o'clock service. If you simply go to the lodge, you turn left, and you walk until you reach the end of the Woodstock Road, where it joins the Banbury Road, and St Giles Church is on the corner. There will be an 8 o'clock service of Holy Communion there. If Michael Roos is still here, it will please his atheist heart, because it's very conservative. It will be the Book of Common Prayer. Although if he really wants to be conservative, he should go to St Aloysius with the Roman Catholics, where it will be in Latin at 8 o'clock. So that's your choice for you tomorrow. Anyway, enough of that. To introduce Naomi Beck, who's our speaker for this evening, whose title is Market Man, or Homo Mercans. She started her life at the University of Paris, produced a PhD on the metamorphosis of ideas, Spencer's evolutionary theory and left-wing politics in France and Italy, which will shortly be published in French. And she's also working on evolutionary ideas in Van Hayek's defense of free market politics. She's worked and studied both in France and in Italy and in Germany and in the States, and now with the Konrad Lorenz Institute in Vienna at the moment. So we look forward very much, Naomi, to what you have to say to us today. Thank you. Right.
Hello, and first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. So, as Mike said, I'm working now in the Konrad Lorenz Institute, and my research in general, I'm interested in the relationship between evolutionary theory and political and economic thought. And in this context, Hayek is a very interesting person to study. For those of you who don't know, this is, of course, a very atypical picture of Hayek, but it fits very well the topic of my presentation today. It is a picture taken by Robert J. Richards from the University of Chicago of Hayek on a rowboat off the coast of Venezuela. He participated in a conference commemorating Darwin's death that took place in Caracas in 1982. So for those of you who don't know, Hayek, a Nobel Prize winner, is mostly famous for his defense of the free market. He was probably one of the most consequential political thinkers in the 20th century. He influenced policymakers such as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, as well as leading economists such as Milton Friedman. And his work continues to appeal to many today. A rather surprising event took place last year in June of 2010, when after a comment made by Glenn Beck on TV, the sales of one of Hayek's most popular books, The Road to Serfdom, which was first published in 1944, rose to the top of the sales list on Amazon.com and stayed there for a few days. So a considerable feat, especially for a dead economist. Now, while Hayek is mostly famous for his defense of the free market, the theory of cultural evolution that he developed in support of these views is not very well known. Yet Hayek argued that there were close interconnections between evolutionary theory, ethics, and economics. In his last and unfinished work, published in 1988, he wrote, quote, "To understand our civilization, one must appreciate that the extended order arose from unintentionally conforming to certain traditional and largely moral practices, many of which men tend to dislike, whose significance they usually fail to understand, whose validity they cannot prove, and which have nonetheless fairly rapidly spread by means of an evolutionary selection, the comparative increase of population and wealth of those groups that happen to follow them. So what I would like to do today is analyze Hayek's theory of cultural group selection and specifically bring out some of the problems that I find with his definition of modern civilization as an extended order, and with his claim that the selection of rules in the process of group selection is actually selection of rules that surpass individual reason, as you can see from this quote. And through my analysis, I will offer an assessment of Hayek's claims qua evolutionary claims, and also an evaluation of the robustness of the theory of cultural evolution that he proposed. And I will reveal my colors immediately. I intend to show that Hayek developed a theory of evolution that is not internally consistent, that his use of evolutionary concepts in parallel is lacking, and therefore his theory of cultural evolution does not provide support for his free market position. So the outline of my lecture would be first part I will explain why I think it is interesting to compare Hayek and Darwin's views on the evolution of morality. In the second part, I will explain Hayek's theory of cultural group selection. Then in the third part, I will bring out some of the tensions that I find in Hayek's narrative. And finally, I'll draw conclusions from my comparison of Hayek and Darwin, from my analysis, and offer an assessment of Hayek's evolutionary theory. So let me start with the comparison between Hayek and Darwin. Hayek had an ambiguous attitude towards Darwin. In some of his writings, he tried to draw parallels, theoretical parallels, between evolutionary biology and economics as two sciences that deal with complex phenomena and therefore have a limited predictive power. I will not go into this today because there is no time for this. Suffice it to say that in those writings, Hayek argued that Darwin, or he celebrated Darwin as a scientific thinker who introduced a new mode of explanation, what he called explanation in principle or pattern prediction. But things were different when Hayek discussed cultural evolution. There he actually tried to downplay Darwin's contribution and emphasize his debt to Adam Smith. He argued that the idea of cultural evolution was older than the idea of biological evolution, that Darwin actually got the idea of evolution from Adam Smith, so from cultural evolution theories, and also that a social scientist in the 19th century who needed Darwin to teach him the idea of evolution was, as Hayek put it, not worth his salt. Now, one of the reasons for Hayek's rather unflattering evaluation of Darwin's contribution to the study of cultural evolution has to do with his claim that the main mechanism of cultural evolution is not Darwinian, and Darwin ignored group selection. But Hayek was wrong. Had he read Darwin more carefully, or perhaps at all, he would have realized that Darwin was actually the first to introduce the notion of group selection. Initially, as part of his explanation for the existence of sterile insects in The Origin of Species, and then as part of his explanation for the moral sense in humans in The Descent of Man. I will not talk about the first one, Darwin's use of community selection in The Origin of Species. Michael Roos actually wrote about this a few years ago. But I will talk about Darwin's views on the evolution of morality and group selection, because this will help me bring out some of the tensions that I find in Hayek's view later on. And you will see that I have a slightly different opinion than the opinion that Michael Roos presented yesterday about Hayek's use of group selection in The Descent of Man. Now, Darwin actually developed this idea of group selection in order to explain the moral sense. And before I give you the gist of Darwin's theory, let me just mention that I do not assume that Darwin was right in my comparison between Hayek and Darwin, but I'm using Darwin as an evolutionary thinker, or as a model for an evolutionary thinker who developed a theory that is internally consistent. What I mean by this is that the theory holds certain assumptions to always be true, and that it is not circular. So causes and outcomes cannot be the same. So let me explain Darwin's views. Darwin initially had a problem explaining the moral sense within the framework of his theory of natural selection. And the problem was as follows. Imagine, as Darwin did in The Descent of Man, a society made of selfish individuals. So an individual who is altruistic, who is willing to perform acts at cost of self and benefit to others, will be taken advantage of, and in the extreme case would die and not leave any offspring. So on average, more altruists would die than non-altruists, and there will be a natural selection against altruism. But Darwin also thought that in a situation in which two groups of primeval human beings came into contact with each other, all other conditions being more or less the same, so if you recall Michael Roos from yesterday, they more or less have the same diseases, they're not going to transmit diseases to each other, then the tribe in which there is a higher proportion of individuals who are willing to defend each other, who are willing to sacrifice themselves for one another, to cooperate for the common good, is going to be victorious over the other tribe. In other words, what appeared to be a winning strategy on the individual level, namely selfish behavior, was a losing strategy on the group level. How did Darwin solve this conundrum? Well, he did it through his theory of group selection. Darwin proposed the following scenario for the evolution of the moral sense. He argued that as humans' reasoning powers increased, together with accumulated experience, individuals learn that helping others increases the chances of getting help in return. And from this low motive, as Darwin called it, today we call it reciprocal altruism, individuals acquired the habit to help one another, which in turn strengthened pre-existing sentiments of sympathy. Now, throw into the mix the development of communication skills, specifically the language of praise and blame, this idea that Darwin took from Adam Smith, and the setup was right, Darwin thought, for natural selection to favor altruistic or pro-social behavior inside the group. Now we move to the next level, and because in ongoing tribal wars between groups, those tribes or groups in which the moral and intellectual qualities existed in the highest degrees would be victorious over other groups and would spread more, these qualities would tend to become more pronounced and more diffuse. In this way, selection can act indirectly on the individual by promoting altruistic traits through the preservation of groups that exhibit cooperative behavior. Now, notice the important role of reason in Darwin's account, and this is where I differ from what Michael Roos said yesterday. If you remember, he tried to emphasize the fact that Darwin was talking about tribes, so the importance of the genetic relatedness factor in his group selection in humans. But as you know, one of the main claims that Darwin made about the evolution of morality is that the difference between humans and other animals is not one of kind, but one of degree. He thought that any animal endowed with social instincts would be able to develop a moral sense as soon as its intellectual faculties would be developed to the same extent that they are in humans. And Darwin actually had a lot invested in the role of reason in cultural and moral evolution because he prophesied, as man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the man of all nations and races. And in another quote, a bit more optimistic, Darwin even thought that this sentiment of sympathy would be extended to all sentient beings. Hayek had a very different view. While Darwin, and here I echo some of the things that Michael Roos said yesterday, and also that I heard this morning in Robert Pinnock's talk. I hope I present your surname correctly. No. Okay. Pennock, sorry. Robert Pennock's talk about the fact that Darwin actually treated the moral sense as sort of an observed phenomenon. You look at humans and you see that there is such a thing as moral behavior or moral sense. And then he tried to explain it, as he said, from the side of natural history. So he was wondering, can my theory of natural selection explain this phenomenon that I observe in this animal that is a human being? Hayek, on the other hand, wanted to use his theory of group selection to justify a specific political and economic structure, namely capitalism. He was a big fan of America. He actually dedicated one of his most popular books, one of his most important books, The Constitution of Liberty, to, quote, the unknown civilization that is growing in America. And in an interview that he gave in 1984, he declared moral views of the next 100 years are going to be defined by the United States more than anywhere else. And his last publication, the one from which I quoted earlier on, in which actually offers the most detailed account of his theory of cultural evolution, had a very specific political objective, which is obvious from the title: The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism. The fatal conceit refers to the belief that the ability to acquire skills stems from reason, which lies at the basis of the belief that humans have the capacity to improve society through rational reform. Hayek argued that this belief, or the misunderstanding of cultural evolution, is the main, the main mistake that socialists make. He claimed that the belief, the fatal conceit, the belief that the ability to acquire skills stems from reason, is actually contradictory to how modern civilization evolved. And he argued that the debate between him and socialists wasn't a matter of values, it was a matter of facts. Advocates of socialism, or more specifically of centralized planning in order to achieve specific common goals, for example, distributive justice, did not understand that what they proposed was contrary to the way modern civilization evolved and therefore doomed to destroy it. Now, Hayek defined modern civilization as the extended order. He sometimes called it the Great Society. He meant this not only metaphorically, but also literally. The Great Society is great because it is big. It allows the largest numbers of individuals to survive. Now, keep in mind this definition of modern civilization as the extended order or the Great Society. It is one of the main reasons that Hayek's evolutionary analysis contains the tensions that it does, and that he ended up developing a theory that is, to some extent, circular. So let me prove what I just said. Hayek claimed that during the longer part of our evolutionary history, we evolved in a situation in which we existed in small groups of 15 to 40 people. He called these the face-to-face troop, and he argued that this type of social existence was conducive to the selection of solidarity and altruism, because members of small groups know each other, they trust one another, and therefore they have shared goals and aims that coordinate their activities. So solidarity and altruism evolved as adaptations to the hunting and gathering lifestyle of small groups. This is why Hayek argued that Hobbes was wrong. So the primitive individualism that Hobbes postulated never existed, because according to Hayek, the members of small groups could only exist as such, meaning that an isolated individual would soon be dead. So the war of all against all never actually existed. In fact, our natural impulses are collectivist. They are geared towards caring for one another and helping each other. They are not individualist. The problem with the instinctual drives of solidarity and altruism was that they apply only to the members of one's group and not to other groups. In other words, they cannot explain the existence of humankind in its modern size and structure. In short, they cannot explain modern civilization. In Hayek's word, natural man is unsuited to the extended order. He argued that in order for the extended order or modern civilization to develop, a new society, a new morality was necessary, one that was better suited for the coordination of the actions of many individuals unknown to each other, rather than the common pursuit of shared goals. It follows that the rules of the extended order are not an extension of our social instincts, as was the case for Darwin. Rather, they are opposed to them, because the small group morality prohibited expansion, and therefore it needed to be repressed in order for the extended order to emerge. this raises the rather obvious question of how did a counter-instinctual morality actually evolve? And here we get to Hayek's theory of group selection. Hayek argued that the rules that were selected in group selection spread not because individuals understood their benefits, but because they enabled expansion, either through increased reproductive success or the inclusion of outsiders. If you recall, this claim that the rules spread not because individuals understood their benefits was actually the main point of the very first quote that I had up. In order to understand this claim, one needs to look at Hayek's distinction between explicit knowledge and what he called the knowledge of how, which is when a person follows a rule without really understanding that rule or without being able to verbalize or describe the rule. His example was the way that children learn grammar. So children can understand the various meanings of different sentences. They can even correct the grammatical errors of others without being fully conscious of the underlying elements of these patterns. And this distinction was important because it allowed Hayek to make a further distinction between, on the one hand, the rules that govern individual behavior, and on the other hand, the order that results from the combined actions of many individuals. And here his examples came from biology. They were the arrow formation of migrating birds, or the defensive ring of the buffaloes, or division of labor in insect societies. And Hayek argued that all these patterns show that it is not awareness by the individuals of the overall order that produces it, but rather some relatively simple rule of how to respond to immediate environment that coordinates the actions of several individuals and leads to the emergence of the pattern. So a group can be orderly without the individuals understanding how their personal actions produce the overall order. In other words, order can be an unintended consequence. As specific examples of the rules of the extended order, Hayek mentioned regulations concerning free market economics, such as the rules concerning private property, exchange, competition, trade, and so forth. And he argued that it is not a coincidence that most of the rules of the extended order are associated with economics, because economics is a science that has been concerned since at least the time of Adam Smith with understanding how an extended order of human cooperation comes about in an unintended manner. So it's the good old invisible hand. Now, because of how the rules of the extended order of the market evolved, namely as the unintended consequence of the actions of many individuals, they surpass reason. And this was the crux of Hayek's theory of cultural group selection, because it allowed him to claim, or it led him to claim, that modern civilization is not the product of rational design and resulted from unwanted change. So the rules of modern civilization were selected because they allowed expansion of those groups practice them, not because individuals understood that they were beneficial. So to recapitulate, the rules of the extended market order, according to Hayek, are first of all counter-instinctual. They go counter to our naturally evolved impulses of solidarity and altruism that developed in the longer part of our evolutionary history, and they surpass individual reason because they result from the combined actions of many individuals, and they were selected in group selection based on the fact that they allow expansion of those groups that practice them. And these two characteristics were the main reason that we have a problem accepting the new morality that is associated with the rules of the market, as Hayek put it. Disliking these constraints so much, we hardly can be said to have selected them. Rather, these constraints selected us. They enabled us to survive. Hayek explained, for example, that market behavior pushes us away from the maxim of love thy neighbor as thyself, to which we are naturally inclined, and towards profit-making. And we tend to feel guilty about this, and we tend to even condone this type of behavior, but profit acts as a signal that guides individuals towards what makes them the most productive. And by following this signal, individuals end up unintentionally helping humanity by serving the needs of many unknown other individuals. Now, this view fits very well Hayek's political position and his defense of the market as a superior social and economic structure that far outstrips the capacity of our reason. Therefore, it outperforms almost by definition any type of social or economic planning. But it presents some very important or problematic tensions when one tries to follow Hayek's evolutionary narrative. First of all, how did the rules of the extended order originate? Hayek argued that the trigger in this process of change were individual path breakers. So some individuals, by using particular information to their advantage, introduced or ushered in a new practice without being fully aware of this. For example, an individual might have a particular advantage that allows him or her to specialize. Then with extended specialization, a division of labor becomes possible. With advanced division of labor, the path is ready for trade and commerce to follow, and you see where this is leading. Now, the path breakers were not aware that what they were doing was actually to introduce a new practice that was beneficial for society as a whole, because otherwise the market order would not be an unintended consequence. So the path breakers didn't have a full understanding of the meaning of what they were doing. And this raises the obvious question of why were they successful and why were they followed? In other words, how did it happen that their individual actions became group practices? Now, Hayek never offered a definition of what a group means, but he did claim that the condition to be part of a group or get admitted to a group is to accept its rules. So then the question becomes, how did it happen that individual path breakers who were not fully aware of what they were doing and acted for their own benefit, so presumably they were not capable of explaining to the other members of society why what they were doing for their own benefit was actually going to be beneficial in the long run for the group as a whole, why were they successful, especially given that their new mode of behavior threatened the cohesion of the group? Hayek, in fact, was pretty clear about the claim that the rise of the market order was actually a succession of economic phases that breached the solidarity of the small group. His examples were the recognition of private property through land enclosures, or allowing competition between fellow craftsmen of the same trade, or allowing lending with interest. And he was clear about the fact that all of these practices threatened the morality, the natural morality of solidarity and altruism of the small group. So the group, logically, should have repressed those individuals. I mean, there is no reason why the group would have tolerated this kind of rebellious behavior only for the profit of self. In other words, it means that those practices, quote unquote, didn't exist long enough to be selected as such in group selection. Hayek's solution to this problem was to claim that the successive path breakers depended on the observation of other rules. So the individual path breakers won the esteem of other members of society by observing most rules, and so they could get away with breaking some, which I guess, I hope you will agree, is a rather weak argument. He also argued that tradition and imitative learning played a key role in making sure that certain practices were kept long enough so that they produced their beneficial effects and be selected in group selection. Hayek argued man is better served by custom than by understanding, and he claimed that the main difference between humans and other animals is humans' capacity to learn through imitation. He actually argued that the last decisive step in our biological evolution, in the biological evolution of our species, was the prolongation of the period of infancy, because this allowed for a longer time to learn through imitation and to absorb tradition. And he defined tradition accordingly as a body of unjustified beliefs or non-rational adaptations to the environment, so rules that we learn to follow without really understanding why. This is the knowledge of how that I mentioned earlier on, and which, according to Hayek, predated knowledge in explicit knowledge, so the kind of knowledge that allows us to predict and anticipate certain results, and that we usually refer to as reason. And it is also in this sense that tradition is wiser than human reason. It represents the accumulated results of an evolutionary process of trial and error, during which humanity slowly gathered experience about which rules work and which do not. So Hayek concluded that cultural evolution is a process lying between instinct and reason. He wrote, "Just as instinct is older than custom and tradition, so then are the latter older than reason. Custom and tradition stand between instinct and reason, logically, psychologically, temporally. Though they are based on human experience because shaped in the course of cultural evolution, they were not formed by drawing reasoned conclusions from certain facts or from an awareness that things behaved in a particular way." But by not allowing reason to play an important role in cultural evolution, Hayek actually ended up developing a rather problematic and incoherent evolutionary narrative. He argued that cultural development is the product of opposing forces in a process that was characterized by a stratification of rules. So, according to Hayek, social evolution leads to a superimposition of traditions or layers of rules that are kept from precedent phases and that often compete and even conflict with each other. We have a first layer, the instinctive drives, those natural impulses of solidarity and altruism that evolved during the longer part of our evolutionary history in the small group existence. Then we have a second layer. These are those rules that were selected in group selection based on the capacity to allow expansion. So these were rules that were imposed upon us. We did not choose to follow these rules. They are moral constraints. And finally, the third and thinnest layer was the layer of rational design. So these are rules that we modified or elaborated specifically to serve known needs or specific needs. And so Hayek argued that modern man, the man of the market order, is torn by conflicts. We are required to live under different kinds of orders with different kinds of rules. The first layer, the layer of the natural impulses of solidarity and altruism, had to be repressed in order for the second layer of rules, those selected in group selection, to take over. And the third layer of rules, those that are rationally designed, also has to be subjugated to the second layer, that is, to the abstract rules of the market order, because more often than not, the rational design is motivated by our primordial emotions that hark back to the natural morality, to the small group morality. Now, I'd like to pause here and show you a short 2-minute video in which Hayek explains this view and how important it is for his political position. And he refers to these three layers of cultural evolution as the three sources of human moral values. And this was actually the title of an epilogue to one of Hayek's most famous multi-volume books, Laws, Legislation, and Liberty, published in the 1970s. So here's hoping that it works.
Our basic problem is that we have three levels, I would say, of moral beliefs. We have, in the first instance, our intuitive moral feelings, which are adapted to the small person-to-person society, where we act for people whom we know and are served by people whom we know. Then we have a society governed by moral traditions, which, unlike what the modern rationalists believe, are not intellectual discoveries of men who designed them, but were the result of a process which I now prefer to describe by the biological term of group selection. Those groups who had quite accidentally developed favorable habits, such as the tradition of private property and the family, who did succeed, but who never understood this. So we owe our present extended order of human cooperation very largely to a moral tradition which the intellectual does not approve of because it is nobly intellectually designed. And it has to compete with a third level of moral beliefs, those which the morals which the intellectuals design in the hope that they can better satisfy man's instincts then the traditional rules can explain the whole of the social conflicts of the last 200 years by the conflicts of the three moral traditions.
So there you go, an explanation of the conflicts, all the conflicts of the last 200 years in a mere minute and 40 seconds. So this brings me to the final part of my presentation and the assessment of Hayek's theory of cultural evolution. That I would like to start with the question, in what sense is Hayek's theory evolutionary? That is, to what an extent is it motivated by the logic of variation, selection, retention, or a gradual accumulation of modifications? And here I'm going to hazard a few definitions. So, evolution means change over time. The theory of biological evolution describes descent with modifications for common ancestors. Biological evolution can take place through natural selection and other mechanisms, for example, genetic drift. So not only natural selection. For evolution by natural selection to work, certain conditions are necessary. First of all, the existence of variations between organisms, so organisms differ among each other, between themselves. Second, the inheritance of traits across generations, so there is a certain similarity between parents and offspring. And finally, a struggle for existence. So a struggle for existence that follows from population growth and population pressure in a situation of limited resources that then leads to differences in the rates of survival and reproduction and to the natural selection of those traits that are most favorable to survival in a specific environment. So the outcome of this process is a certain level of adaptation. Now, Hayek had a very different view. He claimed that all evolution rests on competition and that variation, adaptation, and competition are essentially the same process. But variation, adaptation, and competition are obviously not the same process for evolution by natural selection. If one is thinking about biological evolution, variation is one of the conditions for evolution by natural selection to take place, and competition, if one understands it as the struggle for existence, is another condition, and adaptation is the result of this outcome. Hayek seems to have reduced the entire process of evolution to competition, and more specifically, economic competition. But the two are not the same thing, evolution and competition. And furthermore, it seems that Hayek's understanding of the role of competition in evolution by natural selection was pretty different from the common understanding of the role of the struggle for existence in evolution by natural selection. I mentioned earlier on that Hayek defined modern civilization as the great society, great because it is big. It allows the largest number of individuals to survive. Now, Hayek never viewed population growth as a problem in the Malthusian sense, in the sense that it creates population pressure in a situation of limited resources. He actually argued that population growth is a self-stimulating cause in human evolution. So population growth leads to a chain reaction in a positive feedback loop in which greater density in the occupation of a territory produces new opportunities for specialization. Then with extended specialization, a division of labor becomes possible. With advanced division of labor, trade and commerce become possible. That leads to an increase in individual productivity, which then allows further population growth. So for Hayek, population growth and modern civilization were very close to each other. There were close connections between the two, and this is why he argued that Malthus's conclusions do not apply to the modern world. So the fear of overpopulation was perhaps a threat in Malthus' time when labor was homogeneous, but in modern time when labor is highly differentiated and diversified, and that allows an intensification of the division of labor, an intensification of trade and commerce. Actually, greater population growth allows an increase in population size and density. So Hayek argued that we have become civilized by the increase of our numbers, just as civilization made that increase possible. We can be few and savage, or many and civilized. And you can see from this claim that there is a certain circularity to Hayek's argument. Population growth is both cause and effect of modern civilization. It causes civilization through this process of expansion, but civilization is defined as the extended order, the great society. And you can also see that Hayek's understanding of evolution was very much tinted by his economic views and his belief that growth was the key to progress. In fact, Hayek argued that growth is life's purpose. He claimed that life's purpose is to maximize the prospective stream of future lives, so to produce more life. Life has no other purpose, and he claimed that the aim of evolution was never to gratify human emotions or to produce happiness. He thought that he avoided in this way committing the naturalistic fallacy, because he didn't argue that the extended order or population growth were good in some absolute sense. He simply claimed that it is pointless to ask whether the actions that contribute to the production of more human beings are good in the sense that we desire them, because these actions were selected in a process of group selection. So in the process of selection of rules that allowed expansion, we didn't choose these actions, we didn't choose that type of morality. This morality was imposed on us. Or as Hayek put it, we may not like the fact that our morals have been shaped mainly by their suitability to increase our numbers, but we have little choice in the matter. So for Hayek, the definition of modern civilization as the extended order actually was problematic because it introduced a normative element into his evolutionary analysis. It made him treat only what led to the production of growth in a positive manner, and because it was the way that he defined the new morality of the market as expansion. And this is how he attacked socialism. So the attack on distributive justice, or the attack on the aspiration to achieve more equitable distribution of wealth, was actually motivated by the definition of the morality of the market, or the market rules, as the new morality. Hayek claimed that distributive justice is actually an atavism based on primordial emotions. And he argued that evolution cannot be just. It is senseless to demand of an unpredictable process of trial and error that it be just, because we cannot control the outcomes of this process. And if we try to do so, we will halt the process of evolution. The extended order evolved based on the selection of rules that allow expansion of those groups that practice them, and regardless of our desire for justice. So in the extended order, the success of some causes the failure of others, or in the extended order, reward is not for merit, but this is the price of growth. We simply have to deal with that. Now, this is a very reductive view of the evolutionary process, which essentially equates its outcome with reproductive success. Compare this to Darwin views on population growth in humans. Darwin argued it is impossible not to bitterly regret the rate at which men tend to increase, because it causes infanticide in barbarous tribes, and it causes abject poverty in modern civilizations. But he also claimed that if humans had not been subjected to the struggle for existence, they would never have attained the rank of manhood. This is because population pressure was necessary for the development of morality, because population pressure allowed through struggle between groups for group selection, and therefore the selection of morality. So for Darwin, moral evolution was an integral part of the theory of natural selection, in the sense that he used the same assumption and the same mechanism that he used to explain biological phenomena to explain the observed phenomena of morality in humans. Struggle was a key element in both, and both were cumulative processes. So an increase in reasoning powers was positively correlated with a higher moral development for Darwin. The layers of evolution built upon each other, so to speak. That was not the case for Hayek. He actually argued that reason is like a dangerous explosive, which handled cautiously will be most beneficial, but if handled incautiously may blow up civilization. And the reason is because in Hayek's rather odd, non-cumulative, non-gradual process of cultural evolution, there was a sort of back and forth movement between the different layers. The first layer, that of natural morality, of solidarity and altruism, had to be repressed in order for the second layer to arise. But we still need to keep those sentiments of solidarity and altruism in our more intimate groupings, like the family, otherwise we would crush them, and that is the basis for society. And then the third layer, that of rational design, also had to be subjugated to the second layer, because rational design is mostly motivated by our primordial impulses, and yet it was the second layer that was really the key to modern civilization. In the end, the only function that Hayek allowed reason is actually to understand how a superior market order evolved and how its operation surpasses the capacity of our reason. And he claimed that the main task of the social sciences is to understand the limits of reason. So, in conclusion, it seems that Hayek's theory of cultural evolution is actually a theory of economic growth which uses or co-opts economic terms. But natural selection is not the invisible hand, even though these are the two processes are impersonal processes that lead to some extent to the maximal use of resources. And evolution is not a process that describes growth, it is a process that describes change over time. So though classical economics, Adam Smith, Hayek's big hero, and evolutionary theory share certain parallels, and definitely there was an influence on Darwin coming from Smith, the one theory simply does not map onto the other. Hayek borrowed evolutionary concepts without paying enough attention to their meaning or to the role that they play in the theory of evolution by natural selection, often confusing conditions and outcomes. He criticized so-called social Darwinists for their oversimplified and rather crude application of evolutionary concepts to the social domain. And had Darwin developed a theory of cultural evolution based on selection for reproductive success, then he would have sanctioned probably a selfish morality and would have turned into a social Darwinist of the kind that Hayek criticized. Instead, it was Hayek that, with his own arguments that modern civilization is the extended order, that its rules are selected based on their capacity to allow expansion, turned into that quote-unquote social Darwinist. And finally, this will be my last slide. I want to emphasize what I said in the beginning of the talk and the importance of taking Hayek's evolutionary claims seriously. He was and remains one of the most important and influential free market thinkers. The Mont Pelerin Society that he founded in 1947 and which still exists was for a very long time the center for a worldwide network of individuals and organizations concerned with promoting free market ideas. And it was the inspiration for the foundation of influential think tanks like the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK or the Heritage Foundation in the United States. But as my analysis shows, Hayek's evolutionary theory is lacking and does not provide scientific support for his free market position. In fact, paradoxically, Hayek arrived through his own arguments concerning the evolution of the market and how its rules surpass individual reason to the claim that adherence to the free market is actually a matter of faith, not of fact. It is the old credo qui absurdum est. Thank you very much.
We have time for several questions at this point. Yes, the first one. Can you wait for the microphone to come to you? Thank you. No, it's giving him some exercise. That's right.
If you apply all these ideas to, let us say, 18th century commercial practice and history, do you find that they work? And second bit, what about the agricultural revolution, which wasn't particularly competitive? It was just a good idea that everybody took up.
No, Hayek's ideas do not work. I mean, I did not even attempt here to present historical proof, or at least a body of historical evidence that shows that what he's saying is actually not supported by anything that happened in recorded history. But he was trying to make a theoretical argument, and in that book, The Fatal Conceit, he does offer some kind of an analysis of how trade and commerce developed, and the origin of the law of private property in Roman times, and how long-distance trade began in the Mediterranean, etc. It is very unconvincing. I mean, that would have been definitely the easy way to to refute Hayek. But it's interesting to note that in the time that he published his most popular work, The Road to Serfdom, which one can read in an afternoon, really, and if you don't even want to read it, there are summaries that are even shorter, or even a YouTube 5-minute clip that has slides that summarize the book. The year that he published this, Karl Polanyi published The Great Transformation, and that is a magnificent historical study that shows that actually the free market was imposed in a way that caused a lot of resistance. The spontaneous part of the free market actually came from resistance to free market rule. So that's an example of a good historical study. Hayek is not.
Yes.
Thank you. On my understanding of Hayek, one of his biggest comparisons between economics and evolutionary theory is that no planned economy can work because there's simply too much information that would need to be processed, whereas in a free market you have a mechanism, and this is where the analogy comes in, that is much like the trial and error of evolution, which is a procedure for producing optimal solutions that you couldn't get if you tried to consciously design life. Can you comment on that, please? Because that didn't seem to be an aspect of your analysis of Hayek's connection between evolution and his economic theory.
Yes, you're right. First of all, evolution doesn't produce optimal results. I think that the biologists in the room would agree with that. But second, you're right. Hayek is mostly famous for his claims about the limits of knowledge and the difference between the theoretical knowledge that, say, an economist might have about how supply and demand curves work, and the actual knowledge that an economic player would have of conditions in situ and how to react to certain scarcities or preference changes, etc. He won the Nobel Prize, basically, for this idea, but this wasn't really Hayek's idea, it was von Mises' idea, and it comes from the socialist calculation debate. And Hayek developed it a lot, and I think that one of the things that he really tried to do that was original was to inject this evolutionary content into this idea and to explain specifically why it is that we have this limit of knowledge, or the division between, on the one hand, the theoretical knowledge, and on the other hand, the practical knowledge, and how it is that the market actually surpasses individual reason. There is a situation in which the market sort of evolves before reason evolves, right? So culture actually creates reason, according to Hayek. And that, as I say, I think is his main contribution, to try and inject some kind of empirical content into that claim, that theoretical claim, that there are differences between the different kinds of knowledge.
Anyone else? Yes, fine, okay.
Talking about this idea of Hayek's, that this culture creates reason, I just wanted to ask, when you spoke about Hayek's beliefs about tradition, do you think that the idea of tradition as essentially a selecting mechanism for things that help groups is more palpable if someone with some reason at the beginning put it forth and it came down as tradition? So, for instance, the idea of the Hebrew prohibitions against eating pork or shellfish or something like that. If someone noticed a long time ago that more people were getting disease based on eating these things, and put it forth in a sort of religious, traditional idea that was passed down with lack of reason, then that could preserve that and actually help the species through tradition.
Yes, there is definitely an element of reason, but the interesting thing here is that reason is allowed a very limited critical role in Hayek, in the sense that it cannot criticize the market order at all. The market order outperforms reason, right, by definition. And so you're right about the fact that, certain religious rules might have some, for example, reasons that related to hygiene, and therefore there was a reason that they're kept. Others not. I mean, in the past we used to sacrifice virgins in order to get certain things, and then we realized there isn't really a relationship of cause and effect there. It doesn't really help achieve the outcome, so perhaps we shouldn't sacrifice virgins anymore. So there is also an evolution there, but one needs to allow reason to play a role. I think that one of the reasons that I wanted to compare specifically Darwin, I could have probably compared Hayek to a contemporary to Hayek's time thinker that developed a theory of moral evolution. I don't know, somebody like Hamilton. He developed a theory that is internally consistent. But with Darwin, it's interesting because Darwin, in The Descent of Man, there are some paragraphs where he says, okay, for the evolution of morality to occur, you need... And then he starts a long list of the communication skills and morality, and the intellectual faculties and imitation, etc., etc. And then he repeats that list a few paragraphs further, but in a different order. And I think Darwin did that because he didn't know what came before what. And he was smart enough to be humble about this and say, I cannot really say what exactly happened, but I can say that you need all of these ingredients for this to come out. Hayek actually thought that he could, right? And then he ended up with a very weird theory with sort of these jumps back and forth.
Okay, another go, right. And then maybe one more question.
I'll put you on the spot here. Of course, Hayek isn't the only economist to invoke Darwin. Marx and Engels tried to get on that bandwagon too. Do you, just if you had to go with Marx versus Hayek, can you rate them? Who abused Darwin more? And then a basic informational question. I just wonder, because I don't know if anyone's done this work. Has anyone written a book, Darwin and the Economists? It seems like there have got to be a lot of economists out there who've tried to frame their theory as being the most conciliant with Darwin's theory.
Actually, there is a book that just came out by Jeffrey Hodgson called Darwinian Conjectures, if I'm not mistaken, and it tries to apply Darwinian mechanism of evolution to explain economics. And there is a thriving field of evolutionary economics, but it is more concerned with theory of the firm and trying to explain specifically, how businesses might survive in a situation in which there is limited resources and there is a competition, etc. Now, for your question about who abused Darwin more, none of them read Darwin, I think. So, first of all, they're on a par there. But they both... It's an interesting question because it really shows that when one simply takes in that clip that I showed, Hayek actually says, so I'm describing now a process of cultural evolution using the term group selection from biology. And this is what he did. He just took the term, nothing else, right? So it seemed to jive with what he thought was going on, but he just tried to take evolutionary terms and insert them into a theory of economic growth. Marx, it's a bit more complicated. Engels actually did read Darwin. He read Darwin, I think, a week after The Origin of Species, and he sent it to Marx, and he said, you should read that. Marx waited, I think, 4 years before opening it and didn't really get very far ahead in the reading. He liked a different theory of an obscure French geologist who claimed that differences in the conditions of the Earth actually influence human evolution. That Marx liked because it sort of showed a clear connection between material evolution and human evolution. But again, and Marx quotes once Darwin in Das Kapital, and he does this just to claim something about the development of techniques and stuff like that. He didn't know much about natural selection. What he knew, he said, okay, fine, Darwin just described his bourgeois society and took it and implemented it to the animal world. But this is exactly, I think that the theory of evolution is amazing in that respect, in the sense that, yes, Darwin was influenced by ideas that came from economics, but then he developed a whole new theory. And the theory of biological evolution by natural selection is a theory that, as I said before, has certain premises and it holds certain assumptions to always be true. And Darwin was a good scientist in the sense that once he put those down, he said, okay, now, is this going to explain sterile insects? If not, it's a fatal threat to my theory, right? So he elaborated these ideas so that he turned them into a much more powerful explanation than just taking a term and sort of putting it in the place of another term and assuming that it is the same thing. Science is based on specific definitions. So Hayek was not a good scientist in that respect.
Peter, have the last word. Go on.
First of all, thanks for a terrific talk, Naomi. I just wanted to ask you to expand on a point that you just made. I mean, in a sense, your talk has been about the way in which economists have exploited Darwinian theory. But we know, for example, that Darwin was reading Adam Smith in the 1830s. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the other side of the equation, which is the extent to which Darwin drew on theories of political economy to develop his theory of evolution by natural selection.
So Darwin indeed read Smith, but it was Smith from the theory of moral sentiments that he read, right? Not Smith, the founder of classical economics, from The Wealth of Nations. And I admit that I don't know exactly what he thought about Smith's sweeping claims that humans have a natural tendency to barter, exchange, and trade, or that one never saw a dog exchange a bone for another thing with another dog. There is actually a lot of research today about biological economics and how one can see certain incipient economic behavior in animals as well. But I don't think, I mean, of course Darwin was influenced by Malthus. One can claim that is to some extent political economy. But I don't think that he was very influenced by Smith from The Wealth of Nations. I mean, the invisible hand is really not a natural selection. And the invisible hand, so actually the term appears first in the theory of moral sentiments when Smith says the problem with somebody who wants to get a lot of wealth and therefore sort of, let's say, leads to better agriculture in the land that he or he owns, is that the size of the stomach doesn't increase at the same rate as the size of the appetite. And because of that, there is an overproduction of wealth. And what happens to this? Well, it goes to the poor. And this is the trickling down element in Smith's theory of the invisible hand, which is the reason that why, when individuals act for their benefit, they actually help the benefit of society at large. But you don't quite find this claim in Darwin.
Naomi, thank you very much for a very lucid presentation. Thank you.